you very much for being here on this wonderful Bombay morning when you could be doing so much else and when there are so many interesting programs in the festival. So first of all, obviously, I'd like to thank you for introducing me, and I would very much like to thank the Times Literary Festival for having me for the second time. One of my favorite festivals and certainly one of my favorite cities in the world. I'm very happy to come here. So, the Nile as Metaphor. This was suggested by Bachi. I think it's going to be more, a bit of the Nile as metaphor, but more of the Nile as a symbol, really. And I thought that what I would do, now obviously there are many people in this festival this year who are water experts and who have written books about rivers and water policy and so on. I'm not. I write fiction and I write cultural and essays at the intersection of culture and politics. But I'm Egyptian and therefore have a relationship with the river, and I guess it's on the strength of this that I'm here. So I thought that what I would do is I would talk a bit about the meaning of the river and the role of the river in shaping Egypt, in shaping Egyptian ideas, and almost in shaping, I would say, really the Egyptian character. And for that, we will be going to ancient Egypt, to the beginning of the story. And then, having talked about that, we'll just skip right over to today and to what is happening to the river today. I've got some pictures for you to look at. You will be glad to know. I think that it's always nice to have things to look at, and certainly for a subject like this, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so here, as you see, I have to remember now to just look here and to not think there's anything behind me. There's a screen for you there. And there's one there. Okay, but mine is here. So the river is really, the Nile is really special. It's the longest river in the world. And I think it's also the loneliest river in the world. If you look at where it is, with some of the biggest land masses of desert around it, it feels fragile, and as I said, it feels pretty solitary. Now, when people first settled around the river, way back thousands of years BC, obviously and even when they formulated their relationship with it, they never saw it as we can see it now, as a ribbon stretching across the desert like this. You have to be up in the air to see it like this. But I think that they very much obviously conceived of it in the same way. And it seems to me that the characteristics of the river and the characteristics of its geographical context have been really seminal in formulating Egyptian philosophy and ideology and character. You have a strip of fertile land surrounded by desert, a strip that is so narrow that at any time, apart from in the delta, but until you get to the delta, at any time that you lift your eyes, you can see the end of it at both sides. You can see that is where the green ends and the yellow begins, this side and that side. And so there's a very clear boundary and a very clear sense of difference and of contrast. Also, that strip of fertile land is renewed every year. So the river not only brings water, but it brings new alluvial soil every year. And that is what makes it so fertile. And that is what makes the dependency on the river so complete, really. Surrounding you is the desert, and the desert is your natural boundary. And on the one hand, it is a protection. It's the reason that Egypt, as a state in ancient times, is so stable, is so much more stable than the states in Mesopotamia, for example, because an enemy to come and attack you had to cross expanses of desert either way. But at the same time, obviously, as society developed and as trade happened, you also needed to cross that desert to engage in trade, to engage in exchange. And also, of course, people came across the desert to you. And so there was always, what was the desert going to do? And what was it going to bring? It could bring an enemy, it could bring a friend, it could bring destruction, or it could bring actually sort of something to enrich the civilization and enrich the people. Similarly, of course, with the river itself, that the river is the giver of life, but it's also a destroyer. This is a river that floods once a year, and its flood is so strong. In a way, it's predictable. People know roughly when it's going to be, but they don't know how high it's going to be. They need it. If it doesn't come, then crops will not grow and there will be famine. And if it comes too high, then it will actually destroy crops and destroy houses and destroy life. So you're watching the river, you need it to come, but you need it to come at a certain level. And so again, it's constant. You're living always with something that is constant because you know it's going to come, but that is volatile because you're never sure quite what it's coming is going to look like. Something that you need and that you totally depend on for life, but something that can destroy life. And I think I might have actually, oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to look there. Let's just see. Okay, so that was that here. This is one of the temples for anybody who's been to Egypt. This is the temple of Phiala in Upper Egypt. And this is the temple in a time of flood. So you can see that when the waters rose, they came up to the middle of a high temple. They came up to almost the top of that palm tree. So in order to live and to create the civilization that they created in this location, people entered into a very two-way, a reciprocal, creative relationship with the river, and the relationship with technical, scientific, also imaginative, creative, mythical. So, I mean, Herodotus famously says Egypt is the gift of the Nile, but it's not simply that, because it's the interaction of the Nile with the people in that particular place and with the rest of the geography. So this, for example, here, you needed to study the river from the very beginning. You needed to work out how high it would be or how high it was getting. And taxes were based on the height of the water, because the height of the water told you what the production, what the yield of crops would be. So this is a nilometer. This is a nilometer in Aswan. It's one of the earliest ones, and you can see the markings there that would mark how high the river was coming in. And the Nile Valley in Egypt is scattered with nilometers across the ages. There are some beautiful Mamluk nilometers in Cairo, and well, I mean, every state that came, of course, had to engage with measuring the river. And then, of course, it opens up. In the north, it opens up as it goes into the Mediterranean. It opens up into one of the largest deltas in the world. And in order to make use of that space, again, man had to engage with cutting canals, canals, and well, in Arabic we have more than one name for these little streams. But these are all man-made, and they are what ensures that the entire expanse of the delta is usable, and what makes it one of the most fertile spots in the world. And so to run a country, to run an economy based on this one water source, because there is no rainfall. We might get 3, 4, 5 days of rain in the year, but nothing that you can actually use. And you've got one source of water, and then you have your dugout canals. You can imagine the amount of planning and the amount of strategizing and the amount of, it had to be a central state. There had to be a central intelligence running it, and it had to be run as one unit where people, I should say, I wonder if we've got the, yes. So Egypt developed, because of the river, developed what they call the basin irrigation system. I don't know about agriculture here. I imagine that in India there must be this system, or must have been this system at certain points, where you divide the fertile land into basins, and they are separated by little dams and dikes of earth that people build themselves. And to irrigate, you break open one of these little walls and the water floods in, and then you close it off again, and that's how each basin is irrigated. And it's a very, it's a system, the side product of which is that it ensures that everybody feels that they are part of something bigger than themselves. It's not always good. I'm not saying that this is always wonderful and cooperative. It could be that somebody feels that their neighbor is getting more water than they are, or that they suspect that a neighbor is getting up in the night and opening his dam and letting more water in, or whatever. But it certainly means that you can't think of your fields, your basins, as something isolated and something that just depends on you, or even as something that just depends on the river. You have got to see it as part of a collective endeavor, where what one person does way upriver will affect what somebody else has to do way downriver. And I think that's very much part of how society functions in Egypt, or at least how it used to function, how it might be allowed to continue functioning. But anyway, so so a central system with planning, strategizing, supervision, and communication, because you had to, from way upriver, you had to tell people way downriver that you were opening up, or that the river was coming at this level, or so a really complex and efficient system had to be put in place in order for the country to be run. In the corner of the picture, to the very right, you will see a white bird. So if you just bear that white bird in mind, because we're going to come back to it later. Here it is. So this is the river in flood, and you can see the basins there, and the river flooding them, and then you wait for that flood to recede and for the crops to grow. You also, of course, had to learn to sail the river. And sailing the river meant sailing with the current downstream. So from the south to the north, you sailed with the current. But if you needed to go north to south, then you had to learn to tack with the north wind and sail against the current. So what I think I'm getting at, what I think has hit me as I tried to put this thing together, was that there's always a double. There's always two things. There's the river as life giver, the river as destroyer, the desert as protector, the desert as actually something that you have to go through. Sailing the river has to be done in two different ways. And so there's always a duality in people's relationship with their context and with the world around them. This is a little model of a sailing boat, and there are lots of these little models complete with the small figures, and I don't think anybody knows whether they were made as toys for kids, or whether they were actually models that people used in other ways. You also engaged with, the river, and I think, again, I was surprised looking at the literature and at popular proverbs and so on. I was surprised that the river was hardly used, really. And then I thought, well, actually, the river was so present. You really, unless you were out in the desert, which you normally are not. 95% of Egyptians live in that very narrow strip. The green strip, around the river is about 5% of Egypt's, what is it called? Area, yeah? And 95% of people, of the population, lives in that strip. And so the river is so present. It's everything that you do is related to it. Every time you try and work out where you are in the city, in wherever, that's where you get your bearings. You're working out really what your relationship is to the river. And so maybe that's why people don't actually use it as metaphor. It's much more a symbol of Egypt, of Egyptian life, of the things that we've talked about. But maybe it's like, you don't use your mother, I suppose, as a metaphor, or your arm, or it's just too close to you. It's too much part of you. So this is one of the most famous tomb reliefs, wall paintings that we have, which is Nib Amun fowling, and you can see there the wealth of life along the river. You've got the lotus, the papyrus. You have the birds, of course, and I can't see if you have any fish, but we've got some fish later. And there's Nib Amun with his wife behind him with her perfume cone on her head, and her fan of lotus. In sort of hunting, fowling, fishing. Two male figures in ancient Egyptian art. This is a man who is a bit corpulent. He has a belly, he has man breasts, and this is fertility. This is because he has to share some kind of feminine features that are traditionally connected to fertility. And Hapi is the god of the inundation. He's not the god of the river. He is only the god of the flood. And so people, when prayers go up, it is for the advent of Hapi, and that Hapi should be in a good mood, should come in friendship rather than in destructive mode. And I think one of the strengths of the ancient Egyptian civilization is that people very early grasped symbol, grasped the use of symbol, how you can use symbol, and therefore all these gods were symbols of things, and also your relationship with them used symbols. There was a whole Orientalist trope about how Egyptians used to throw a young woman into the river as a bride of Hapi to appease the wrath of, etc. But then it turned out that there was absolutely no evidence of that at all, and in fact there was no evidence ever of human sacrifice, because again people had grasped the value of using symbols rather than using the actual things. But what there was that every year there was a festival for the flooding, for the inundation, and it was the festival of Hapi. And statues of Hapi in, I think it was either cedar wood or sandalwood, statues of Hapi and his consort were made and were thrown in, were given to the river along with written texts asking for what the country wanted that year, and they were given to the river as gifts in a big celebration. And that celebration actually, in one form or another, continued until quite recently, because of course we now don't have the inundation because the high dam in the 60s stopped it. But until certainly the 50s, there were celebrations and boats and lights and music at the time of the flood, both to celebrate that the flood had come without bringing destruction, and to have a continuity with the ancient Egyptian traditions. So even though the river is not a god, it plays a really important part in the what we loosely call mythology, in the story that ancient Egyptians told about the creation of the world. So the story of the creation is actually similar to many other stories, which is that there were the waters. There was the waters of chaos, and they're called Nun, the waters of Nun. And out of these waters of chaos, there emerged the world. And the world, of course, was Egypt at the time. And this is probably, I mean, people think that, I mean, it seems intuitively right to believe that this was a story based on what people actually saw, because the flood came and it covered, the river is full of small islands that are partially inhabited or semi-inhabited or not inhabited. And when the floods came, they would cover these islands, so you couldn't see them anymore. And when the flood receded, you could see the islands rising out of the water. So as the chaos of the flood receded, the islands would rise out of the water. And you can actually, because of course the dam is opened periodically and the water flows, even though, you know, by design, not through nature, you can still sometimes see that happening. Occasionally, now you can see like clumps of earth that have separated from the river, and there are rushes on them, and they just float downriver, and you really get a sense of what it is that they saw 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years ago, and out of it built the story of the creation of the world. Now, you remember the white bird that I said, please look at in the corner of the picture. The story goes, well, actually any time that you see one of these little islands of foliage floating down, there will be at least one, if not two or three or four, of that white bird on it. The white bird is the cattle egret, and it is the Egyptian ibis. And in common talk, it is known as Sadiq al-Fallah, the farmer's friend, because it's in the fields. Whenever the farmer is working in the field, these birds are dotted around him, and they eat worms, and they eat particular parasites that are really harmful for humans, but that are fine for them. So they have an important ecological role in the process of agriculture. So the story of the creation has it that as Egypt emerged, or the world emerged from the waters of chaos, the waters of the flood, the first creature to be standing on it is the ibis. And the ibis is then Tuhut, spelled in English Thoth, which is unpronounceable, but his name is Tuhut. And he is the god who later in Greek becomes Hermes, and in Roman becomes Mercury. So Tuhut is the god who he's an engineer and an architect and a mathematician and a linguist. He combines the functions from, which later in the Greek are split up into Hermes, Apollo, and Prometheus, because he is the god who works on earth to help man to build civilization. You'll find that in the foundation stones of temples, for example, the king is often standing with Tuhut, with measuring lines and instruments and so on. So basically, he is the first creature to appear because he is totally crucial to civilization, but he's not alone. Here he is. Yeah, so I was making the point that this is, Tuhut is the ibis, is the egret. And he's not alone because always with him is his consort. And his consort, her name is Maat, M-A-A-T. She never has a head other than her own. She's always a beautiful woman. And she always has this feather on her head. And Maat is, as Tuhut is the principles of science and technology and language, Maat is the ethical and moral principles along which life needs to be conducted. We'll see for example, and you can see, obviously, I mean, the symbolism is very obvious. You need technology, you need science, but they always have to be married to an ethical worldview. And here they are. There's Tahut. This is a burial scene, and you can see him on the right with her, and here they are protecting. Pharaoh manifests himself as Horus, the son of Ra, so here they are protecting him. And here they are. This is pretty crucial. This is a scene from the book which has forever been called the Book of the Dead, but actually in Egyptian is the Book of Going Forth by Day, which is the book that guides you into what happens after you die. And this is the judgment scene, and you see in the middle there that black pole, and coming on either side, this is the scales. On one side of the scale, to the left, is a container, and the container has the heart of the dead person who is being tried, and he is to the far left, him and his wife in the white of the shroud. So there's his heart on one side of the container, and on the other side of the container is a feather. And the feather is the feather of Maat. And your heart needs to be equivalent to the feather of Maat. So Maat here is represented by the feather, whereas Tahut, you can see him right there. And behind him is the devourer who lives below the river. And this is the worst fate that can befall anyone, is that their soul is given to the devourer. That means that they're finished. They have no further life, either in this world in terms of reputation and fame, or in the next in terms of immortal life. Now, the feather of Maat is articulated in 42 rules for living a good life. I'm not going to go through them, obviously, but they contain things like, they contain the 10 Commandments, obviously, I did not kill, etc. But they also have things like, I did not put myself above people, I did not cause the shedding of tears, I respected my father and enjoyed the tenderness of my mother. They're a full kind of dustur, a full constitution on how to live a decent life. And in them is the river, again. So I did not pollute the waters of the river. I did not waste the waters of the river. They are of the statement that when you die and you're being judged, you have to be able to say in order to be permitted into the underworld. So there's the river again, and here, this is a very abstract representation, but now you can see that there is Maat sitting, her knees are up, and she's sitting straight, and the feather is on her head, and she's holding in her hand a symbol which everybody is very familiar with, of course, which is the Ankh. And the Ankh there is the key of life. It always represents life, and it's, they never spelt it out, but the theory is, and I intuitively think, because in temples, a lot of temples, there are two axes. One that axes with an E, one that is parallel to the river, and one that goes east to west like the sun. And there it is, these two axes in the Ankh, and that is, of course, the whole secret of life in Egypt. Without the sun, you would not have life. Without the river, you would not have life. And they both cross each other. They intersect, and their intersection is life. And very, very often, that is what Maat has her feather, and she's holding the key of life. And it's this insistence on the presence of Maat, on the presence of ethics and morality in life alongside everything, that I think is really, really key to ancient Egyptian civilization. And going back to this question of duality and the Nile as destroyer and life giver, and the desert as potentially also destroyer but also bringer of good things, the idea in ancient Egyptian ideology and the idea of Maat is never about any kind of permanent state of things, any kind of decisive victory of good over evil, it is always a balance. It is always harmony. So, and that is born of the circumstances in which people lived and the truth of what they saw of life, that it was always a negotiation. The forces of chaos were always there and were always active, and you were always trying to bring order out of them. And because it is active and because it is ongoing, it's also dynamic. So the order that you might bring today is different from the order that somebody else might bring 100, 1,000 years from now. But it's always this dialectic, and it's always this issue of balance, that you just try not to permit chaos or not to permit evil to go too far in that direction. 5 minutes? Okay, so then I will romp through the today stuff, because that's really to say what's happening with the river now. Now, obviously, we built the high dam in the 60s, and that was to control the water, to make best use of it, and also to create electricity, to modernize and to build factories and so on, which we did. But because the policy, and that's the high dam, but because the economic policies of the country changed after that, with Nasser dead and Sadat in power, the follow-on projects from the high dam were never put in place. So what has happened now as a result of the high dam is that the silt, the alluvial silt that used to come from the south all the time, has stopped coming. And that, of course, is eroding the fertility of the land. We also, and again, this is completely due to mismanagement and corruption, we have enormous amounts of pollutants in the river from just normal garbage. And this, again, I mean, if we had a couple of hours, we could go through the corrupt contracts that were put in place during Mubarak's time, which gave rubbish collection to French and Spanish firms, and which ended up in rubbish just accumulating and people not knowing what to do with it. Obviously, things like how much more plastic is used and how much more these horrible white fiber plates are used and are thrown into the river. So there we are. And actually, remember that picture of the delta with most of these little man-made canals are looking like this now and are semi-blocked. There's also industrial waste, and this is again corruption, because factories, we have a lot of cement factories and a lot of phosphate factories, basically because they're cheap, the material is there, and you can make a lot of money out of them, and all their chemical waste is pumped into the river. And now there is the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which is being built, and which is actually going to, if not cut off, then drastically reduce the amount of water we're getting in Egypt. And again, this is directly attributable to politics, because Egypt was very, very close to Africa in the 50s and the 60s when it was the liberation movements and so on. And in the time of Sadat, and much more so even in the time of Mubarak, Egypt turned its back on Africa. We kind of were better than them, and they were black, and so on. And basically, we left our hinterland, our strategic, hinterland unprotected. And so now General Sisi every few months signally fails to come to any agreement with the Ethiopians about water resources. So the last bit now, this is the river in Cairo. This is Nile Bridge. This is the heart of Cairo. I live very close to that, actually. So this is what it still looks like. I mean, basically, if you were to visit Cairo today and look at the river in Cairo, you wouldn't know any of the things I'm saying. But it's very much in the consciousness of people. And this is an iconic photo from the same bridge, Nile Bridge, during the revolution of 2011. This is the 28th of January, when people were fighting you can see on the right there an armored police personnel carrier spraying water on the protesters. This is on the right is Tahrir, and the protesters are trying to get to Tahrir and to take Tahrir, and they're being prevented. And in the end, actually, of course, they do, as we know, but it's a short-lived victory. But one of the really high priorities with people then was to do something about the river. Two delegations, people's delegations, in January and in February and March went into to Ethiopia, to Somalia, to Nile Basin countries to mend fences, to say, you know, we're sorry we've been behaving badly for 3 decades, and will you please be friends again, and so on. We received very warmly. A lot of documentation was made of pollution of the river. It was really high on people's priorities, but of course that's now all gone. And what we have instead, actually, and this is my final point, is that what the government is doing is it's marking prime locations on the river and trying to empty them of people and sell them off. Sell them mostly to Gulf companies, to Gulf projects, to create what they would like to be sort of Dubai on the Nile. And so you get sort of amazing locations. This is where which is an agricultural island in the heart of Cairo. It has about 60,000 people living on it, and they've lived on it for about 150, it was settled about 150 years ago. And the government is actually part negotiation, part the army goes down, fighting them to try and get them off the land. In order to create this, this is the model of what Warra' would be like, with towers and high-rises, and with its own little glass pyramid at the bottom of that arrow. You could not actually be more kitsch than this. This is another area. This is right next to the television building and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Maspero Triangle. There's the river. You can see it there. It's a prime location on the river. And this was the kind of house, old 19th century houses they had, and this is what they've done to it. And this is the plan for what it's going to look like. So I'm stopping here. This is the river at night. It looks wonderful. It looks pretty stable. It looks as if it might be there forever. I hope it will somehow. And I'm going to end on a personal note. Our family has a houseboat on the river where we still do sort of family lunches, breakfasts, celebrations, whatever. You can see the river up there in the left-hand corner. And we still go, and we don't tell the children that the river is polluted and that the river is in danger of drying up. We just let them enjoy it and build a relationship with it. And I chose this, well, this picture happened to be on my phone, and I've used it because bottom right-hand corner is the oldest member of our family, my aunt, and top left-hand corner is the youngest member of our family, my first grandchild. So that kind of pulls the old and the young together. And thank you. Thank you.
That's all me. What an incredible way to start today's session. But I'm sure the audience will need some clarity and thought. Audience, over to you. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? Well, then I have a question. Okay, sir. Yes, please proceed. No, it's okay. I'll ask. Go ahead. Yes, sir. Sorry. Please proceed.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Recently I spent quite a bit of time in the Iranian city of Isfahan. And the people there seem to have a very, very strong emotional bond with the river that sort of splits the city in two. It's been dry now for the past few years, and for them it almost seems like a betrayal, you know? Like the river has ended up betraying them. It's a very deep emotional bond. It's almost as though the river has taken on a form of a human or a relative or that sort of a relationship. I wanted to ask you whether in Egypt, in cities, especially in the larger cities like Cairo, whether there's such a strong emotional bond between the people and the Nile, or is it too much to ask of modern day living. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So, obviously, I mean, I think that there is a really strong bond. Basically, the Nile is very much represented. I mean, it keeps coming up in art, in music, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
But there is a practical bond, which is that you see people going out to the river all the time, in the summer particularly. So the sort of going out to the bridges, you very often find wedding parties, for example, that go to the bridge so that the bride and groom can have a photo with the Nile behind them. You find also the little pleasure boats where you can just, you know, book a seat for a few pounds and it'll, you know, go up and down. There's a particular genre of song. Its name is Mahragan, which it was a song. It was a genre from the back streets, which nobody, say, in my bit of society had ever heard of. And during the revolution, it broke out into the open, became incredibly popular. And the most place you can hear it now is pumping out from the river, from the boats on the river. So the river is very, very much part of people's lives all the time. Yeah.
Thank you for your question, so that was very relevant. Does anyone else from the audience have any question? Okay. Yes, ma'am, please. Can we have a mic? Just 1 second.
Yeah, I think we've met before, actually, haven't we? Yes, we have met before. Yeah, I kind of, the success of Map of Love gave me a platform, which I then sort of, I was living in England, and I felt at that point, I mean, I felt that it was my responsibility to use that platform to write about Palestine and to write about politics and cultural politics, and I kind of got swept away in that. I hijacked myself into that kind of writing and that kind of activity. And obviously then with the beginning of Egyptian protests, now we're talking about 2007 and 8, and then the revolution, I just have been in that world. However, I am now very much trying to go back to fiction, partly because I think that my mind just really works in that way, and partly because I keep being asked about it. And even like we would be on a protest in the street and there would be tear gas, and some young person would say to me, "And when's the next novel?" I say, "You know what? I'm here." Well, and also, anyway, so yes, I hope so. It's really hard. It's really hard, and I'll tell you the central reason why it's hard is that the novel, I can't see a novel that isn't based around a few individual characters. That there's the protagonist, there are a cast of a few people, and the reader gets engaged with them and wants to know what happens and so on. And I find it very, very hard after the last 10 years or so to privilege any individual story, because the stuff that is happening around us is so big, and it involves and affects so many people directly. Not in the way that everything affects everyone, but in the way that people go out for a peaceful revolution and end up being tortured and killed, or people dare to cross the sea in search of a better life, and and these sort of mass things seem, they are just overpowering, and I have not yet found a way of legitimately isolating a few stories to build a novel around. But I hope I will.
Yes, sir, please.
Ma'am, you spoke about this island in central Cairo where people are being asked to vacate and the army is coming in to raise the buildings. Is the government trying to relocate them somewhere or just go ahead, get the hell out and go to the desert?
No, they in theory relocate them. So they will say, we will move you to a place where you will have better buildings and so on. This might be a lie, and it might not happen, or it might happen, but these buildings are like, they build small towns in the desert, for example. So say 20 kilometers, 30, 40 kilometers out of Cairo. And the buildings are decent, but there's nothing. And even if they build a school for their kids, where are these people going to work? And their whole lives are, you know, there. If they work in Cairo. If they grow, you know, their fields, whatever. And so they don't propose to give them an equivalent livable life, nor do they propose to give them enough compensation that would enable them to build an equivalent life.
Yes, ma'am.
To what extent is there the pollution problem present in the consciousness of the people? And if so,
Sorry, the what problem?
the pollution problem. And you know, if so, is that a way to put pressure on to try and get something done about it and to tackle the problem?
That is a really interesting question, and it's a question that, you know, people are constantly trying to figure out. Pollution is present in the minds of the people to the extent that anybody who can afford to buy bottled water now does, or anybody who could afford to put a filter in their houses now does. It's sort of in one way, it's beyond what people can do. If you're living in a village and you're now not any longer using sort of everything that you use is biodegradable. Now you use plastic, and you know, and there is no garbage collection. Then the most you do is collect from the village and then dump by your canal outside the village, and then it all slips into the canal. So it is kind of a lot bigger than what individuals can do, even though there are constantly initiatives. The other thing is that at the moment and for the last 2 years, any initiative that is set up has to come from the government. Because if anybody tries to set up anything on their own and organize, they will just get arrested, whatever it is that they're trying to do. So, in fact, yesterday, as I was preparing for this, I found that that they had declared yesterday Clean Nile Day, and they, you know, were proposing that people go and collect. So, yeah, I mean, it is present. Some stuff is being done about it, but certainly not anything like enough. Yeah.
So here's a point of discussion, and not just for Ahdaf. I would even appreciate if the audience would join in, give me your opinions. So Ahdaf, there was a point that you mentioned that Egypt is a gift to us by the Nile, and it doesn't stop right at that. It's more about the interaction between people and the river, which is stemming down to interaction between us, the natural resources given to us. So do you believe that the time we're living in currently, us humans have started talking so much and listening lesser to the needs of the natural resources? Does anyone have anything to say about that? Ahdaf, over to you.
Well, I think that there is a strong awareness now of environmental issues, of the ecology. I think there are very strong movements. I'm not really sure about here. I know in Egypt at the moment there aren't. There would have been, and there were in sort of 2011 and the run up to it. At the moment it's all very quiet. But certainly in Europe, yes, I mean the movement against big oil, against the extraction of fossil fuels, and it started way back, really, with people like Rainbow Warrior going out to prevent the hunting of whales and so on. So I would say this has been, it kind of started up about 30 years ago, and it's going strong. And I think that the hope for the planet, I think young people do see that we're killing the planet.
Yeah.
And I think that the hope for the planet is that these movements kind of like, actually do create a network and do somehow acquire power. The only political power that seems to be on the horizon is the Green Party in Germany, which seems to be like actually making serious gains. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there are sort of a whole load of older industrialists who don't care at all because they're going to be dead in 5 years. And I think it's got to be down to the young to impose a better way of dealing with the planet.
So it seems more like the millennials today, and I'm saying this being a part of the millennials, we feel a lot of burden, knowing that all the pressures are on our shoulders, because we read things about tribes, in the ancient times where tribes used to worship natural resources. That was their form of God. And what was that point, if you can define it, when everything started shifting from that thought process and we started moving into a more industrial age where it was more about development rather than the environment?
People have written books about this kind of thing, and I mean, if I had to, off the top of my head, I would say that things changed in the 19th century with heavy industrialization, and that they've taken a turn for the worse in the last 20 years with a type of capitalism that basically does not respect anything, does not respect human life, does not respect the planet, does not respect resources, and this is what has to be fought. And I agree with what you said at the beginning. I think I and a lot of people of my generation feel very sorry and feel very guilty that we are handing you a world in this condition and saying that it is down to you to fix it. And really all I know many people like me can say is we're there behind you to help and to do whatever it is that is possible, but it's very hard.